Hi, welcome to Board Gems. This is my weekly video series in which I cover an older, potentially forgotten about game. So usually these are games that are 10 years old or older. Maybe they didn't have crazy high ratings on Board Game Geek, but they are good games. And it's possible that newer people into the hobby maybe haven't heard of them or don't know much about them. So it's kind of what I know, so I try to cover them. This week's older game is from the mid-'80s and is called Wildlife Adventure. Now, this was published by Ravensburger and designed by Wolfgang Kramer. It's for 2 to 6 players, although you probably want the middle range. But it works, it's just probably best with the middle range. And the box says ages 10 and up, but that's an overestimate. I feel 8 and ups could definitely play it. I'm cheating a little bit this week because this actually isn't the game I want to do. Wildlife Adventure came out in the mid-'80s, and in the mid-'90s, a kind of a revamped version of this was published, and in most editions was known as Expedition. Expedition came out in the mid-'90s, and you can see the differences because they're the same game, but you can see kind of the progression of the designer, Wolfgang Kramer, and his improvements that he made over the game in that sort of 10-year span. And you can see kind of the 80s sensibility of this game versus the 90s kind of improvements and mechanisms that we see. I'm going to show you Wildlife Adventure first and show you how that plays. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences in Expedition, and then I'll talk about why they're board gems. Oh, one more thing. I have a really bad tripod, and I didn't notice when I was teaching Wildlife Adventure that it was a little bit askew, a little bit askance. I wasn't trying to be creative and do like a Dutch or Deutsch angle. Whoa! No, it's just a little bit of, so sorry, it's a little bit askew. Apologize for that. To set up the game, place the board on the table between the players. Shuffle up these smaller cards. These are the chance cards. They're just kind of like chance cards in Monopoly, so shuffle those up, keep them nearby. These thin things, these are travel vouchers. They're kind of the currency of the game. Each player gets 10. You can spend them to take special actions on your turn. Put the arrows, there's 3 different colored arrows representing the 3 different expeditions in the game, and put them to the side of the board along with the 3 obstacles, which start off the board. Finally, shuffle the animal cards. You're going to give each player a hand of cards based on the number of players, check the rule book, and then there's going to be 6 face up. One thing you need to check for these cards here is to make sure that none of them are too close to the starting location. I think the limit is 3, so 3 is okay, like the bald eagle here, 1, 2, 3, that's fine. But if there are any cards here that are closer to the start than that, you have to replace them with new cards. On a card, there's some information down here, which is information probably about how endangered it was circa mid-'80s. What you really care about is the border color and the name or picture. So the border color indicates what continent or what region the animal is on. You'll see there's 5 regions. There's kind of Australasia, there's Asia, Africa, North and South America. This kind of teal, kind of aquamarine color represents North America. And so to find where the prairie dog lives on this map, you would look for the picture or the name. Each card is unique and has a unique spot on the board where you can find that animal. The purpose of the game is to study these animals. You want to study the animals that are face up. All the players want to study these ones, but each player also has their own secret hand of cards representing animals that they alone wish to study. And during the course of the game, there will be 3 expeditions starting from Europe that will be traveling all across the globe. And your goal is to get the expeditions going in the direction you need them to go in order to study the animals that you need to study. The expeditions are kind of jointly controlled by all the players. So on a player's turn, they have an option of extending an expedition, one of the 3 expeditions, in a direction of their choice, with the hope of guiding it toward the animals that they want to study. when an expedition visits a spot for which a player has the card in their hand, they get to reveal it and put it face up in front of them, and they'll get 1 point for that at the end of the game. The game ends either when all the arrows run out, so all the expeditions are finished, or one player is able to get rid of all their cards. And then the game ends immediately, and each player counts the number of cards they have left in their hand. That's negative points. And the player with most points wins. So determine a start player. According to the rules, the youngest player goes first, which is code for there's an advantage to going first. So the least experienced player can go first. And on a player's turn, the main thing that they do, and they'll always do this if they're able to, is to have one of the 3 expeditions travel in one direction. So the start player on their turn takes any of the arrows, any color that they want, and extends the expedition to a new point from their current position. At the start of the game, all the expeditions are currently still in Europe. So a player could put an arrow like so, along a line, to a new location. Now the red expedition has traveled to North Africa here. And at this point, any player who happens to have the Mediterranean monk seal in their hand can now reveal it, put it face up in front of them. That'll be worth a point at the end of the game. And then it'll be the next player's turn, barring special actions that you can do by spending travel vouchers. The next player's turn, they can extend again any of the 3 expeditions. If they picked red, then they would have to extend it from this place because this is where the expedition is now. But they can choose a direction. They can go here or there, anywhere they like so, and repeat. Or if they pick a different expedition, then it's from their starting point. For example, the blue expedition is still at the start. So you can have the blue expedition go this way if you want to. So on your turn, you pick one of the 3 expeditions and you place an arrow going from their current position, which is always the end of the last arrow, to a new location. You can't immediately double back. You can't place an arrow like so, for example. You can have the arrows run parallel. For example, if the red loops around, it can go back this way. Or you can have a different expedition go parallel, but you need to spend travel vouchers to do that. We'll talk about the travel vouchers later. Now, on a player's turn, they can also claim one of these animal cards. Now, this is, of course, public information. All players can see what animals are available for all players. And if ever an expedition travels to that location, so let's say the red expedition is going like this, and then a player puts a red arrow down here, that player may then claim the matching animal card. But only the player whose turn it is. Normally, if an expedition goes to a space, any player who has that card is able to score it. But these public ones are only available for the player whose turn it is, if they can bring an expedition into that spot. And importantly, these cards do not replenish in this game. So these 6 that you start off with are the 6 that are going to be, the only 6 that are going to be there for the whole game. You'll notice there's a bunch of different colored spots on the board. Like I said at the beginning, there's these animal spots, and there's a different color for each of the 5 regions on the board. But you'll see there's also red and dark green and dark blue spots, which don't have any animals associated with them. Each of those spots does a different special action. The player who has an expedition travel to that space then gets a benefit. If you go to a red spot, you draw a chance card and read the text out loud. If it has no black star at the bottom, for example this one doesn't, then you just simply do what the card says and you discard it. But some of the chance cards have a black star on the bottom. And after you read it out loud, place it face up in front of you, and you can use that on a later turn. Or even the current turn if you want to. You can use it immediately, but you don't have to. You can save it. But the point is, it's public information. All the players know which chance cards players have in their hand. If you go to a dark green space, then you immediately get to add an extra arrow. And it doesn't have to be the same expedition. It can be a different expedition. But it's just a free arrow that you get to place on the board. These spaces You'll notice they're numbered, Roman numerals 1, 2, 3. That's because, the Earth is circular, or for board purposes, it's cylindrical. You can go this way and come out this way. So an arrow that goes to here can then later on come out the other side, always with a matching number, so to there, for example. The dark blue spaces, if you go there, you draw 3 travel vouchers. And except for chance cards, that's really the only way you can get travel vouchers. Another option, you don't have to take travel vouchers. Instead, you can make every other player draw an extra animal card, just to bring them farther away from finishing the game. But travel vouchers, this is the currency of the game. And on your turn, before or after you put down the arrows, you can spend up to 3. Some actions require 1 voucher, some actions require 2. You can spend a travel voucher to take an obstacle and move it to a new location. The obstacles start off the board, so when you move it, you move the first one, you're going to move it onto the board. Then afterwards you can bring in a new one or move an existing one. And the obstacle goes on a line between 2 spaces. And as long as that obstacle is there, it is not possible for an expedition to move along that path. But of course, the future player could then spend a travel voucher to move it. Another thing you can spend a travel voucher on is to replace one of your animal cards. Sometimes, especially later in the game, the expeditions have traveled all over the board and maybe you missed the opportunity to get an expedition close to one of your animals. You can spend a travel voucher to return that card to the bottom of the deck and then draw a new one. The actions that require 2 vouchers involve placing and removing arrows. And that's the way to remember it. If it involves an arrow, it costs 2. If it doesn't involve an arrow, it costs 1. For 2 travel vouchers, you can add an extra arrow on your turn. You can also remove an arrow, and this is useful because if an expedition goes right past where you need it to go, you can kind of cancel that move by removing an arrow. You can also spend 2 travel vouchers to run an expedition parallel to an existing one. So you could spend 2 to take an arrow and put it alongside an existing arrow of either color. So like I said, for red, you can't immediately go back like that. That's not allowed. But if red happens to loop around, then you could spend 2 travel vouchers to have it go back on its original path. So the game continues like this until all the arrows run out. That will end the game. If all the arrows of one color run out, then players still play with the remaining arrows until all the arrows run out of all 3 colors, or one player is able to get rid of their last animal card. So they have no more cards in hand, all their cards are face up. The game immediately ends, and players score 1 point for every animal card that they were able to put in their pile, that they were able to study, and minus 1 point for every animal card still in their hand. That's it, you're ready to play Wildlife Adventure. This game, Wildlife Adventure, came out in the 1980s. And in the 90s, a revamped version came out, which in most editions has been known as Expedition. The rules are a little bit revamped. I don't have Expedition to show you, but I can describe the rules differences using this map. Note that the map is a little bit different, though. There are different lines, different spots, so it won't be exactly the same if you try to play Expedition on this one. But there are important rule differences, and I'd like to talk about those. For one thing, there are no chance cards. It's just not in the game. There's also no obstacles. And the voucher system is kind of simplified in that each player starts with 3, but there's only a couple of actions and each action costs 1 voucher. So it's a little bit simpler. There's only 3 actions you can do: add an arrow, remove an arrow, or replace one of your animal cards. And unlike in Wildlife Adventure, in Expedition, when you choose that last option, you'll get rid of your existing animal and you'll draw 2 cards from the top of the deck and choose which one you want to keep. In Wildlife Adventure, you just draw the top one, that's what you get. And these cards replenish. So if a player is able to claim the bald eagle by getting an expedition going into that spot, then it replenishes. So you would draw the top one from the deck and add that. Another difference is with loops. If players make a loop, then immediately the player who makes the loop, so places this last arrow, immediately gets to extend the expedition from a new starting point. And at this point, that starting point can be anywhere that the expedition has previously traveled. So for example, you could go this way, or even start from scratch again if you want to. So basically this expedition is kind of done with the loop, and then they retrace their steps and go off in a new direction of the player's choosing. The game does not end immediately when one player gets rid of all their cards. Instead, you finish the round, so each player has the same number of turns. These rule changes are pretty much all for the positive, and Expedition is probably the way to go, as opposed to Wildlife Adventure, which is lighter but also simultaneously a little bit more frustrating. You can sort of play Wildlife Adventure with Expedition rules. It won't be exactly the same, but for the most part those changes are for the better, and you can give it a try. So if you notice the difference between the two games, Wildlife Adventure and Expedition, you're seeing an evolution of the mechanisms as to what was considered acceptable or even good in one decade versus another decade. So in Wildlife Adventure, which came out in the 80s, it was very common to have a little bit of light, take that, maybe put some obstacles on the board, give people lots of options, but not necessarily a lot of direction or control. Like if you're trying to do a particular thing, you have a lot of options, but it's hard to get your strategy going in the direction you want. And there are some elements which can feel unfair, which is, for example, the game ends immediately on a player's turn as opposed to finishing the round, so all players have an equal number of turns. These are improvements that were made in Expedition that came out about 10 years later. And that game being in the 90s, you can see that evolution of Wolfgang Kramer, what he's thinking of in terms of improving the game. The map is a little bit different. I haven't really compared the two maps. I know that there are more connections in Expedition from Europe. I'm not sure about elsewhere, but the maps are a little bit different. But the other mechanisms are real improvements, I feel, at least from a hobbyist point of view. And I've played a lot of old games and new games, and I like to think I know what's good or bad, at least from my point of view. And you can see that evolution, you can see that improvement over the decade, right? It's like, oh, a designer returns to a game they designed 10 years ago. If they were to design it now, what would they do? Well, have an equal number of turns. Instead of just drawing a random animal, if you have to exchange one, have them draw two. Because otherwise it's a waste, right? Like if you're discarding a card because you think there's no chance that you'll be able to get to that animal, and you draw another one, the other one might have the same problem. At least you have a choice in Expedition, right? So actually, Expedition would have been sort of my board gem, at least from a mechanisms and gameplay point of view. But there is one thing that I prefer in Wildlife Adventure, and that is the board. Okay, it's a little bit corny, it's a little bit, I mean, it's definitely old-fashioned, right? But the board, which you've seen in the How to Play video, it's bright, it's colorful, the map kind of stands out, and the animals kind of add to the map as opposed to take away from the map. And I have not seen a version of Expedition that I liked nearly as much. Each one has some problems. You know, they used to say this about Medici, which is that there's no perfect edition of Medici because every board has a different problem that makes you feel like, oh, this is not right. Like they should have done this differently, right? And then 5 years, 10 years later, they make a new version of Medici, and it turns out they fix that problem, but there's a different problem, right? In Expedition, so there's a few different versions. The older version from the 90s, which was known as, alternatively, there was like a National Geographic branded version of Expedition. The most common one at that time, the older one, has a map. The map itself is fine, But instead of having the animals and their outlines and just kind of freeform on the map, instead they have like rectangular images superimposed on the map. I don't think they're studying animals. I think it's more of like monuments and stuff like that. So they have like little images of where you're visiting. And just personal preference, I find that really weird and stark to see a map which is kind of bright and colorful, and then there's all these rectangles all over the map. To me, it just takes away from the look of it in a way that this doesn't. Now, there's a newer version of Expedition, which was put out by, I think it was 8th Summit Games. I also know there's a new German version from Amigo, and that the map, maybe it was an attempt to be cooler. I don't know. Like, this one might look a little childish to people, right? But instead they went kind of dark, and I'm gonna joke, edgy, you know. I don't like the dark board. Maybe to some people it looks cooler, but it makes it harder for certain things to stand out, right? I personally find, you know, generally you want contrast, but you can't always have contrast. You could have a light board with light things that actually still mostly looks okay, unless it's like really pastel. But like a dark board with dark things on it, to me, just looks terrible. You have to kind of really focus and concentrate and see what's going on. And, you know, this sort of game, it's not, if it was a strategy game, maybe it wouldn't matter so much. You're studying the board anyway, maybe. I know dark art's gonna make it look a little bit cooler to some people, but I think that takes away from the experience, especially with a light family game. And even Expedition is a light family game. I mean, don't think that the improvements were to make it more gamer friendly. They absolutely do, but it doesn't change the weight of the game. It's still a nice, light, family friendly game, really easy for people to get into, really easy for multiple generations to play, right? 8-10-year-olds could play this game with their grandparents. It's one of those styles of games. Definitely you wouldn't consider it a hobby game, but it's, especially Expedition, so this is a family game, and you probably only would play this edition with families. It does have kind of some disappointing things in terms of the mechanisms in play that really kind of give me as a hobbyist pause. So a game like Expedition is great. It's the best of both worlds because it is a light family game, and it's one that young people and old people can play together. It's really kind of fun and engaging. And yet, if you're going to play with hobbyists, it still works because it is fair, right? Of course, it's not going to have like a huge amount of strategy, but it's just a different genre, right? It's a family game. And I think it's really interesting and fun where you have the 3 expeditions and you're trying to get them to go where you need them to go. And you have a little bit of control, but not fully, because there's the chaos of the other players also doing things and going in directions that maybe you don't know about. So you can't plan in advance. In that sense, it reminds me a bit of Transamerica and Trans-Europa, which I'm not sure is in shot. I have them both in a little box there. That's a great game. I'll probably do that in a Board Gems video sometime. It's the same in the sense that there's a kind of a joint organic play that happens when all the players are interacting with the same shared space and growing something together. But they're trying to grow it in directions that benefit them. And what ends up happening is you have this kind of, like I said, like an organic kind of result, which you have some control over, but not fully. The games aren't really similar at all, except that they do have that shared kind of idea of the jointly controlled things that grow based on all the players' interactions. And it has a similar player range. Transamerica, Trans-Europa is also 2 to 6 players. Probably don't play with 2, but anyway, 3 to 6 players. The games aren't really all that similar, but they are similar in those ways. And if I had to pick the 2, I'd pick Transamerica, Trans-Europa, mainly because it's kind of shorter. I mean, that game is only like half hour, 40 minutes. This one can take a while. So this game is probably, you're looking at 45 minutes to an hour. Maybe for some people that would be a little bit long, at least to some hobbyists, for what you get out of it. But it's kind of a standard family kind of game length, right? This version does include information on the animals, circa 1985. So, I don't know, maybe some of those animals are extinct now. I'm sad now. So it's not up to date, this information, but it's nice to have. It's a little bit of a learning experience for the kids, so the kids can come and they can actually. So what you can do actually is, because as I presented it in the how to play part, the goal is to study these animals, right? To go to these locations and study these animals. So what you can do with kids is you can have the kids, when they go to a location, they can play the card and then, so they'll score it, and then they'll read it out loud. So this is the information they got when they studied it, right? Here's information about the animal, here's why it's endangered. So it's an all right learning experience. I mean, if I'm going to play an educational game, I'd rather play something like this, which is a half decent game. You know, there are some games that are educational and that's their point, and the game is just extra, right? And those are never fun for somebody who's into board games. But this one is a proper game that has a small educational element, and I think it's great, like I said, for a mix of kids and adults. I like this game. I'll play either version. I'll play this or Expedition. I do have a preference to Expedition. One nice thing is that a lot of the changes that were made in Expedition, you could sort of retroactively apply to this one. So like you can change the voucher system up, you can get rid of the chance cards. I haven't tested that because the map is different, so it's not going to be exactly the same. There are red spots on the board in which you draw chance cards. So you have to figure out kind of what to do in those cases. But to change how the loops work, right? So then you can actually have an expedition go off in a completely different direction if you make a loop. So there's at least some chance that the expedition can go back. Obviously, you have the same number of turns, having a choice of cards when you draw. Just these are all improvements. And a lot of them can be made to this old edition. So really, old or new is personal preference. I like the rules of the newer Expedition, but I kind of like the look of this one a little bit more. Have you seen this box cover somewhere else? You have, if you're in the hobby. Richard Breese came out with a game a few years ago called Inhabit the Earth, which is a much more serious, a much more gamer's game, like a hobby game. But interesting callback. I mean, you're not going to mistake either one on the shelf, because you're not going to see this on the shelf of a game store these days. So if you see this art, it's Inhabit the Earth. Be careful, it's not the same game. That game you probably don't want to play with little kids. It's a more involved game. One thing I will say is this box is just a little bit too large. You can't really tell, like, in terms of scale. Oh, maybe I can do it. Hold on. A Ravensburger game that I've done before, which is Flug der Mumie, Pyramid. Okay, now this is, if you're in the hobby, this is a pretty standard box shape. You'll recognize this box size and shape from games like Power Grid and similar. So you can compare. You can see it's a little bit taller there and a little bit longer there. For a person who collects board games, and I really don't like having this oddly shaped box. But yeah, I recommend either game. I would have a preference for Expedition except for the board. And I know the board looks a little bit corny and childish, but everything stands out. It's clear. It's just the style of game, right? It's a game that's kid-friendly and has a small educational element. So, of course, it's going to have an appearance which is friendly to kids, as opposed to kind of the darker, more serious Expedition that came out in the last few years. I actually prefer this kind of style, but Expedition as a game does have great improvements over this one. Either way, they're board gems, honestly. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like Wildlife Adventure and Expedition don't stop being good just because new games come out. Take care.